What's up, Sooner Nation? Welcome to the SI Sooners podcast. Man, Parker, we got great news today. You and me are both going to Fort Worth. We're going to be at Amon G. Carter Stadium. We're going to have all the coverage from the OU-TCU game. Even though we got word yesterday that COVID cases in the great state of Texas are on the rise, and the TCU volleyball team, the women's volleyball team, just today canceled matches this week with Kansas and next week with Texas. Parker, man, I sincerely hope this doesn't mean there's an outbreak on the TCU campus. I mean, we just had an open date. I feel the need for football.
Yeah, well, I tell you what, John, now that you and me are double teaming it down in Fort Worth on Saturday, we better hope there's not a COVID outbreak, because I think one of us can afford to go down, but if the virus nabs us both, we're in trouble.
That would be big trouble. I'm John Hoover. I'm in Tulsa. That's Parker Thune. He's over in Norman. Thanks for listening to the SI Sooners podcast. Listen, our numbers are going up all the time on this thing, and that's because of you guys, our listeners. We appreciate that. And thanks also for watching the SI Sooners podcast on my YouTube channel, John Hoover Media. Those numbers are good. They're holding steady as well. You people have a real appetite for this stuff, so we're doing our best to bring it to you twice a week. On the podcast, on the video podcast, I'll remind you again, big favor, if you do like listening to our pod, I guess this is the audio side. If you do like listening, give us a rating, a comment, and by all means share the podcast whenever you can on your social media channels. Let your friends know. Same if you're watching YouTube, though. Same thing. Like, comment, share. It does. It really, really helps the old YouTube algorithm. Parker, we're going to go deep today into TCU. We're going to look at the series between the Sooners and the Horned Frogs, which is unbelievably competitive, but yet shockingly one-sided. We're going to talk about the Mutual Admiration Society going on between Lincoln Riley and Gary Patterson. Yeah. That is a society, by the way, in which I think Alex Grinch wants membership. I'm going to play you a little clip from Lincoln Riley and one from Patterson. And in the last segment, yeah, it's Wednesday, so you know what that means. It's mailbag time. But first, let's get into the game, Parker. Let's talk strength on strength. The matchup between Oklahoma's offense and TCU's defense, man, I love it. It's always entertaining. Gary Patterson, he gets those undersized, under-recruited, undervalued, just ballers, just dudes. Guys that go out and play their guts out. And that's really the biggest reason to me why he's been successful. He loads up with football players, not necessarily athletes, but football players who have a chip on their shoulder, and they're mad that they didn't get offered by Texas. They're mad that they didn't get offered by A&M, and they're mad that they didn't get offered by OU in most cases. And then they go in there and they just grind, and they get better, and they get coached, obviously, but they're competitive as hell, and they fight and they scratch and they claw and all that, and it's just the kind of battle that players, listen, on a lot of teams, like Texas, don't want any part of. And that's why TCU has beaten Texas 6 out of the last 7 years. Have they been better than Texas? Well, yeah, sometimes. And they do have some studs, but sometimes they're not better, and they beat them anyway. Now, some of those studs I was talking about, Trayvon Morey got some preseason All-American love. He's a 6'2", 200-pound safety. He's the kind of guy that OU would love to have this year. Garrett Wallow also got some All-American run in the preseason at strong side linebacker, but he's just 6'2", 230. He's probably only a dark horse to play at the next level. I guess the point here is, yeah, they're not supposed to be better than Texas, Parker, but they sure play better.
Well, and they don't recruit athletes, John. They recruit scrappy. And I think that's the difference between the Gary Patterson mentality and the mentality of a lot of other Power 5 teams. Is you look at programs like Texas, like UCLA, like USC, even some of those bigger name brand schools that haven't necessarily been as successful in recent years, and you look at the guys that they're recruiting, they're trying to recruit the most outstanding athletes at their respective positions. What TCU does is they just try to recruit the guys that, like you said, are football players, the guys that are going to get in there and compete, and they're not going to care how they stack up physically against the guy on the other side of the line from them. They're just going to give it their all. They're going to be hard-nosed, tough, fly to the football on defense. And that's one of the things that has marked Gary Patterson's defenses over the years. That, and of course, the unique 4-2-5 scheme that he runs. That's really the reason why TCU has been as successful under Patterson as they have. You think about it, John, it was, what was it, only just a decade ago, 2010 and 2011, that TCU actually had back-to-back undefeated seasons. And so this is a very viable program, and one that I don't feel like gets enough credit for being as competitive as they are year in and year out. And they have fallen upon harder times recently. Things haven't been as top of the line the last few years for the Horned Frogs and for Gary Patterson as they were in the early part of the 2010s. But this is still a program that week to week can go toe-to-toe with just about anybody. And never an easy date, and that's what Lincoln Riley emphasized in his press conference yesterday. Was it's never easy playing these guys. Whether we're in Norman, whether we're in Fort Worth, they always bring their A game, and they're always hungry to beat us.
Yeah, now listen, their strength is in their secondary, kind of opposite of what Oklahoma is. Noah Daniels, I think, is really good at corner. Darius Washington, he's a small guy. He's only 5'8" at weak safety, but he's a playmaker. I think he's basically what OU wanted Buki Radley-Hiles to be. And then you got a guy like LaKendrick Van Zant. He's the strong safety. He's 6'1", 195. He's athletic as heck. He hits like somebody who weighs 235 pounds. Now, Pro Football Focus rolls out the analytics and loves TCU, especially Trayvon Moehrig. Highest graded secondary in the country last year. Highest forced incompletion rate. Morgan and Washington graded out, get this, number 1 and number 2 in the nation last year among safeties playing in the Power 5. Wow. And all those guys did was combine for 9 interceptions last season, which was more than 41 FBS teams, Parker. What did you find out about the linebackers, the front 7, basically?
Yeah, well, you mentioned the guy that's the standout there in Garrett Wallow, a guy that was a preseason All-American. Parker Workman, another fantastic player at that edge position. And you think about Nook Bradford, who had the 100-plus yard pick 6 against Oklahoma last year in Norman off Jalen Hurts that very nearly turned the tide and got TCU back in this game. And again, I want to emphasize, John, none of these guys from a physical standpoint, and this kind of goes back to what you were just going into, from a physical standpoint, none of these guys jump out at you. And I feel like that's the reason why a lot of people tend to undervalue the efficiency and the scrappiness of Gary Patterson's defense, is because they look at that defense and they don't see any phenomenal talents that are for sure going to the next level. TCU has never produced a Kenneth Murray kind of defender. But you got so many guys, and you hit all the prominent ones, John. You think about LaKendrick Van Sant. You think about Trayvon Moehrig. You think about Garrett Wallow. These are all guys, Darius Washington as well. These are all guys that have a chance to play NFL football. They just don't necessarily get as much love as some of their peers at their same position, simply because they don't have those big hulking bodies and those highlight reel hits that you look for in a defensive player at the collegiate level when you're talking about guys potentially taking it to the next level and playing professionally. But all around, TCU doesn't really have an ostensible weakness on defense. And so that puts the onus on Oklahoma to come out Saturday and play well-rounded offense and not rely too heavily on the run nor the pass, but be able to incorporate a combination of both and attack TCU at all levels of the field.
Yeah, you mentioned it earlier. Patterson's calling card really is that 4-2-5, and the thing about that is that it almost never looks the same from one play to the next. Quarterbacks, they go up to the line of scrimmage and they see 2 deep safeties and they think, okay, we'll throw it here. Well, no, you're not. Or they'll sit back and they'll see 8 in the box, right? And they'll say, well, this is a pass play. We're gonna throw it here for sure. Run it against the 2 deep safeties. I think I might have said that wrong, but listen, TCU dictates what you're doing by disguising what they're doing. The O-line, they come in and they set up for their usual zone blocking scheme because everybody's right where they're supposed to be, right? Normal stuff. Or they're reading the mic, or maybe they're trying to ID the blitz, and here it comes. It looks like it's going to be here, and it looks like they got it figured out. But then, boom, when the ball is snapped, TCU does something totally different. Now, having said all that, that's a lot of praise for Patterson's Froggies, I know, but Lincoln Riley and OU have just been fantastic against those guys. Here are OU's yardage totals for the 6 games that Riley has faced TCU. 536, 534, 533, 536. You see a pattern here? Also 511, and then in the 2017 Big 12 title game, it was only 461. OU has scored 30 points or more in all but one game, and a couple of times they've scored 52. So bottom line here, OU has won 8 of the 9 meetings since TCU joined the Big 12. So there's that. Up next on the SI Sooners podcast, we're going to dive into the TCU offense. Hey, are you a business owner looking to get your product out there to the masses? Let's say you run a hotel in Norman or a car dealership in Oklahoma City or a restaurant in Edmond, or maybe you're a small online business who creates and sells OU merchandise and you just want Sooner Nation to come sample your wares. Well, then consider advertising in this space right here on the SI Sooners podcast. SI Sooners reaches thousands of readers, viewers, and listeners literally every day, and the SI Sooners podcast is the ideal place to find your next customer. To advertise, send an email to allsoonersi@gmail.com or DM us on Twitter at @all_Sooners. Follow SI Sooners on Twitter at @all_Sooners. Find Parker at Parker Thune, Thune. I'm at John E. Hoover, Hoover. Parker's also on Instagram at Parker Thune. I'm on Facebook, John E. Hoover Media. Our website is allsooners.com, and it is free for now. If you love OU and OU football and basketball and some other stuff, you probably ought to get there. Parker, we even got golf, soccer, volleyball. We're kind of putting together a really talented staff for you guys, thanks to Parker and his connections at the OUJ School, I'm happy to say. The video version of this podcast is on my YouTube channel, John Hoover Media. Don't forget, if you are watching that YouTube channel, it is eventually going away. It is going away. So I need you guys to subscribe to my other YouTube channel right here, because everything I post here is being posted there first. Eventually, that'll be the only one left. Okay, Parker, we took apart the TCU defense. Now let's get to the TCU offense. Sonny Cumbie, the offensive coordinator, I think he's gotten pretty good at his job. It helps when you have a returning starter at quarterback, and that is exactly what he's got in Max Duggan. Duggan is a big guy, fast, strong, good runner, all that. His career long as a rusher now was 62 yards last year against OU, but I think he's still polishing things up as a thrower too, Parker.
Yeah, certainly. And, you talk about Sonny Cumbie, a guy who's certainly familiar with offense in the Big 12. He played quarterback at Texas Tech right when Mike Leach and company were starting to turn things over to the air raid, and you were starting to see those ridiculously high offensive yardage totals and the numbers that were just eye-popping. And so Cumbie's a guy that's been around this conference for quite a while and knows what he's doing, knows what it's about, and he's got a phenomenal guy at the quarterback position in Max Duggan, as you mentioned. And I drew the parallel today when I was publishing one of my stories, John, between Duggan and Sam Ehlinger, because I think those guys are two similar quarterbacks, and I don't think people pay enough attention to how similarly those two play the quarterback position. Duggan is a better thrower than Ehlinger, and that's what makes him so dangerous, I think. But when he takes off running, you can just see how competitive Duggan is. You can see how much he wants to absorb contact, how much he wants to plow somebody, get those 2 or 3 extra yards, get a first down, whatever it might be. But Duggan plays the position with a little bit of fire. He's actually he's a guy that played high school ball just about 30 minutes from my hometown over in Council Bluffs, Iowa. So I'm very much familiar with Duggan as a quarterback. And, getting the nod for TCU last year as a true freshman was probably a lot more than he was anticipating. But the reality of the situation was he was the best guy for the job at that point for Gary Patterson and TCU. And he was a little bit in over his head at times last season. But he also showed some flashes of brilliance. And the Oklahoma game is no exception. He very nearly led the Horned Frogs to an upset victory in Norman. And really gashed the Sooners both through the air and on the ground. Now, we kind of got the sense at the beginning of this season that maybe Duggan's job was in jeopardy. We saw Matthew Downing make the start against Iowa State. Duggan eventually re-entered the game, which to a certain degree was to be expected, but it seemed like Gary Patterson might have been toying with a 2-quarterback system there for a little while. But as of right now, it looks like Duggan's the guy. He's definitely the most physically talented quarterback on that roster. And if you think about what he was able to do against Oklahoma's defense last season, he's, like I said, very, very much similar to Ehlinger in that I think his primary desire is to run the ball to set up the pass, because I don't feel like many people acknowledge or recognize how good of an arm Duggan actually has. And it really helps, John, that he's got so many weapons in the passing game. You think about Tay Barber, Artavius Lynn, Pro Wells, who was a second-team All-Big 12 tight end last year. And hey, one guy I will shout out, being a Nebraska native, John, is the Nebraska transfer, J.D. Spielman, who was a 3-time All-Big 12 selection for the Cornhuskers. That guy can play some ball. In the backfield, you got Darwin Barlow, as well as Amari DeMercado. So TCU's got a lot of guys that can contribute and contribute meaningfully. And so the strength in numbers is what Oklahoma is going to have to combat more than anything else on Saturday.
You know, the thing I noticed about Duggan from year 1 to year 2 is his completion percentage. His first 3 games last year, 50.6%. 50, okay? His first 3 games this year, 68.8, and that's all Big 12 competition. So shows what a year of coaching and a year of work will do for you. Now, he got off to a slow start because he had that off-season heart procedure. There was some concern if he was ever going to play again. But he gets in, gets on the field, wins the job back, not going to be a problem. He's a stud again. Hopefully he's healthy and good to go. But you could tell he really put in the time, the effort, the hard work, and it shows, I think, in his game. And as you mentioned, he's got some talent around him. There's not a lot of household names. Amari DeMercado is the starter. Darwin Barlow was the number 4 running back in Texas in last year's class. DeMarque Foster was the highest-rated recruit in the 2019 class out of Wichita Falls. And then 2 true freshmen in the backfield are trying to get on the field. Kendre Miller ran for 2,500 yards and 34 touchdowns as a high school quarterback. And Zach Evans was the first 5-star signee in the history of the program. He was a guy that came in really late, way after signing day. But, you know, I even picked Evans as my Big 12 newcomer of the year thinking, well, those other guys are young. He's going to have a lot of opportunities. Hasn't worked out that way. He's only got 3 carries in 2 games so far this year. And then at receiver, you mentioned Tay Barber. He's been the man so far. I think he's probably their best overall receiver, 13 catches, 144 yards. He's just been kind of really good in his last 10 games. I think in his last 10 games, 42 catches, more than 600 yards. You got a guy like Blair Conwright, who's been good. True freshman Quentin Johnson is only averaging 24 yards a catch. That's not too bad. But the name everyone in Fort Worth wants to see more out of this year, yeah, he's a guy from your neck of the woods, as you mentioned, Parker. It's J.D. Spielman. As you said, 3-time All-Big 10 receiver, 36 career games, 175 catches, transfers to TCU this past summer. Guy's been a disappointment so far. I know. COVID, 3 games, all that stuff. Weird offseason, transfer in, everything's a little bit off for him. He's going to make plays, but as of right now, he's only got 5 catches for 56 yards, no touchdowns. He does get the ball on jet sweeps once in a while, so he's a guy that Oklahoma's going to have its eye on when he's lined up wide or in the slot. He has made a splash on punt returns. He's very dynamic there. Still, I think, you know, Parker, none of this matters if the Horned Frogs can't get Oklahoma blocked. What does that matchup look like to you?
Yeah, certainly. And, you know, you think about what Alex Grinch, well, I guess not what Alex Grinch was saying, but what Alex Grinch was asked about in his press conference last week, how they had used Nick Bonito to kind of contain Sam Ehlinger. And how I think what Alex Grinch termed it was a mug, if I remember correctly, where Bonito is kind of playing a hybrid defensive end spy kind of role. And so you think about what the Oklahoma defensive line looks like heading into this game. The assumption is that they're not going to have Ronnie Perkins. That's not 100%. We're still kind of waiting to see how it all plays out. But coming off a 6-sack performance against Texas, you know that Sooner defensive line is going to be hungry. They are going to have their work cut out for them going up against a mobile guy in Max Duggan, but Bonito, Isaiah Thomas, 2 guys that really stood out in the Red River Showdown and can bring some pressure off the edge. So even if they don't have Perkins, John, I think Oklahoma's going to be just fine. And they've obviously got depth. That depth took a hit today when we found out Zacchaeus McKinney was hitting the transfer portal. But for the most part, everybody that's contributed on the defensive line for the Sooners thus far this year has done an admirable job. And there have been gaps, there have been certain points along the timeline where that level of play has dropped, and you have seen teams dominate Oklahoma in the running game. You look at Breece Hall at Iowa State as a perfect example of that. But I think given the success that Oklahoma had against Ellinger for the majority of that game against Texas, and we talked about it with the players today, they have a lot of confidence going up against Duggan, being able to get pressure on him and make sure that he's not allowed to escape the pocket and get downfield.
Up next on the SI Sooners podcast, I have a feeling we're going to talk a little bit about Ronnie Perkins. It's the SI Sooners podcast mailbag.
Hey there, loyal listeners. Parker Thune here with SI Sooners. Are you a business owner looking to get your product out there to the masses? Let's say you run a hotel in Norman, or a car dealership in Oklahoma City, or a restaurant in Edmond. Or maybe you're just a small online business who creates and sells OU merchandise, and you want Sooner Nation to come sample your wares. Consider advertising in this space right here on the SI Sooners podcast. SI Sooners reaches thousands of readers, viewers, and listeners literally every day. And the SI Sooners podcast is the ideal place to find your next customer. To advertise, send an email to allsoonersi@gmail.com or send us a direct message on Twitter at @all_Sooners.
Final segment of the SI Sooners podcast. Parker, before we get to the mailbag, I want to talk about how much respect is on display, especially this week, between Lincoln Riley and Gary Patterson. I mean, honestly, I think Lincoln Riley respects pretty much everybody they play. I think he respects Tom Herman, really, truly, even if he doesn't really outwardly show it like he does with all the time, and especially this week with Gary Patterson. He's right, man. It's a fun matchup. It is maybe the best offensive mind in college football against a guy who has, for 20 years now, been one of the top defensive minds in all of college football. He's really established himself as I called him a defensive genius. He is. He sees the football field like few can, and we heard that from Alex Grinch today as well. This is Gary Patterson's 20th year as the head coach down there. I looked it up, Parker. They've been in the top 25 in total defense 13 times in his first 19 years. Plus, they were 27th once, so just outside the top 25. This year, as you mentioned, they have hit some hard times, especially the last couple of years. I think didn't make a bowl last year. They're 1-2 right now, but could be 3-0. But this year, they ranked 26th in the country. In the Big 12 now, think about that. That's pretty impressive. So 4 times under Patterson, TCU has led the nation in total defense. Think about that. That's including 3 straight years, 2008, 2009, and 2010. I mean, 9 years later, Lincoln Riley's OU teams lead the nation in total offense 3 years in a row, 2016, 2017, 2018. So, yeah, these guys really respect each other. They get it, what the other one's trying to do. They understand what the guy's going through, what the expectations are. I want you guys to listen to what Lincoln said yesterday about Gary Patterson this week.
Hey, Lincoln, if you think about how much football has changed kind of in the last 20 years, why do you think Gary Patterson has remained so successful at holding on to the tenets of defense like he has? Because even as the spread has literally changed the face of football, you've got Gary's teams who are still playing defense kind of like they did 20 years ago, and that's obviously not something every team can say.
Yeah, no, it's impressive. I mean, I think he's got a lot of things in place. I mean, I think they've got a type of player that they identify and go recruit and develop. And he knows exactly what he's looking for within his system. Everybody knows exactly what he's looking for. And I think the continuity of obviously him being there and several members of that staff for a long time is apparent. I think he's done a good job, in my opinion, of sticking to his core principles, but he certainly has adapted to. I mean, there's some things that he's doing now defensively that I don't think he would ever even thought about doing 10 years ago. So he's been kind of right on the line to, in my opinion, where you want to be. You got like core base package, fundamentals, philosophy that you believe in, but not so rigid that you don't adapt as the game does evolve. And he's I think found a great balance. And then I mean, the guy's a good coach. I mean, you could tell the players are well coached. You could tell they know where to be, what to do, and that's a reflection of him and his staff.
And here is for you a clip from Gary Patterson talking about Lincoln Riley.
One thing I think that's one thing with Dan that Lincoln does is, he's one of the more creative people in the business, and I think that's one of the things that gives people problems.
Okay, Parker, you ready to get into the mailbag? This is always the fun part.
Let's make it happen. I'm hoping we've got some good questions today. I'm scrolling through the list, and these will be fun to get through.
These are fun. These are always fun. Okay, I'll start off. J.C. Norvell asks about the NCAA suspensions of Ronnie Perkins, Ramondre Stevenson, and Trajan Bridges. Told you. Trajan Bridges, by those guys, by the way, I should say, I think they're all playing this week, Parker. I just have a feeling. I think the NCAA suspension has been served. I don't have any authority. I don't have any insight from the coaching staff. Lincoln Riley hasn't shared his deepest secrets with me on this. I just think the NCAA penalty has been served. 5 games, water under the bridge, get those guys back on the field. Now the question becomes, how much have they been practicing? How active are they? How strong are they? How much can they help, basically, against TCU? So JC asks, is there any question if the LSU game counted? Or is it simply a mathematical, legal question about what constitutes half a season, Parker?
Well, John, at this point, I think we just all kind of have to acknowledge that to a certain degree, we have no idea what's going on with these suspensions right now. We don't have any knowledge from the NCAA or from the university. We don't have any indication when these suspensions are going to be lifted. I think the assumption that everybody is operating under was that they were going to be eligible for this weekend against TCU, or at the very least eligible for next week against Texas Tech. But again, that's just based on what the NCAA has laid out in terms of the duration of a suspension, and who knows how COVID has played into that. Who knows whether they're counting the bowl game. No one has a definitive answer. And so I would love to say with some degree of certainty that you're going to see Ronnie Perkins, Ramondre Stevenson, and Trajan Bridges on the field for the Sooners in the next couple of weeks. But hey, at this point, we don't know. And I think it's somewhat damning that whenever Lincoln Riley has been asked about it, he hasn't given even the slightest indication that they're close to getting back on the field. It's always, no, I haven't really heard anything further. And so that would indicate to me that maybe there's a little bit more going on behind the scenes than we even realize, and maybe it's a little more nuanced than we all seem to believe at this point. All right, John, your turn. Oh, and I'm glad you get this one, because I would go off. Brett Crawford asks, if Lincoln had started Kyler over Baker, do you think OU beats Georgia and wins the national championship? Baker was awesome, but Kyler is something else.
If Kyler plays instead of Baker that year. Brett, you already know my answer because I put it on Twitter like an idiot. I'm supposed to save those things for the podcast, but anyway, I appreciate the question, as always. Here's what I said. Obviously, Kyler adds the run element, the athletic element, the dynamic element, but I think he gives ground to Baker in a very important category, leadership. I think that's a given. Kyler probably an overall better player, although Baker was, according to our poll, the 5th best player in Big 12 history. But you're right. Kyler was special. Don't get me wrong. Baker was and is an unbelievable thrower. And remember, I dug this stat up several years ago. He's the only player in college football history with 14,000 passing yards and 1,000 career rushing yards. So think about that. But I think Baker got it done kind of with his personality and his forceful leadership style as much as he did with his arm talent or athletic ability. I mean, just remember, he transfers in from Texas Tech, and the first thing he does after leaving the intramural field, where he was staying in the dorms with some non-athletic regular people, NARPs we call them, I guess. That's what my daughter told me anyway. The first thing he does is he gets in a dance circle and blows everybody's socks off with how good of a dancer he is. That's Baker Mayfield. And we're seeing some of that, I think, translate into his career so far with the Cleveland Browns, particularly with some of the commercials he's made. My wife asked me the other day if he's got a career, like post-football career in acting. I don't know. Maybe. You never know. Parker, Jason Moore asks the question, who will have the biggest impact of the suspended players? I've heard Bridges is the best wide receiver on the team, but Stevenson and Perkins have proven track records. And what freshman will emerge as we enter the second half of the year? Real quick, let me jump in here because I got to answer these. I think Hazelwood is the best wide receiver. He's hurt. I think the biggest impact will be had by Stevenson of the suspended guys, and I think the freshman we'll see emerge, Parker, is Joshua Eaton. Now, I yield the floor to the gentleman from Nebraska.
The gentleman from Nebraska. That's going to be my new Twitter bio, John. No, but I think in terms of the freshmen, it's clear that Lincoln Riley really likes Mikey Henderson and the element that he's brought to the Oklahoma offense. The issue is he's stuck in kind of a log jam at that H-back position with Austin Stogner and Braden Willis and Jeremiah Hall ahead of him. I really like your answer, John, because I do think among the freshman defensive backs, Joshua Eaton is the most gifted. And another thing you have to look at is, okay, where is a guy going to have a natural opportunity to make a difference as a true freshman? And right now, that secondary is kind of a shoddy unit. And if there is going to be an opportunity for a freshman that hasn't seen much of the field thus far this season to see more of the field in the second half, I would argue it's the secondary. So I agree with you. I think it is Joshua Eaton. Now, as far as the suspended trio, the easy answer is Ronnie Perkins, because I think pound for pound, he's Oklahoma's best player when he's on the field. But I think you also have to look at which position groups are in the most need right now. Where is it most necessary for you to add depth, for you to add a talented player that can contribute meaningfully immediately? And for that reason, I again agree with you, John. I think Ramondre Stevenson is going to be the most impactful when he returns, simply because that Oklahoma backfield collectively is averaging 3.6 yards per carry. And Seth McGowan has been great. Don't get me wrong. That dude's got a definite future, and he's going to be the bell cow for Oklahoma sooner rather than later. But in the here and now, there is no back in that backfield that has the physical tools and the skill set that Ramondre Stevenson brings to the table. He's 6 feet tall, 240 pounds or thereabouts, and he's got burst. He runs with some desire. And so I think if and when he's eligible again, he immediately is the guy. And we've talked about this time and time again. But Stevenson, I think just because he plays running back and the running back position is an immediate area of need for Oklahoma right now, he's going to have the most impact when he returns to the field, even more so than Perkins, though I do believe that Perkins, like I said, is Oklahoma's best player, all things considered. All right, John, next one for you. Kurt Crawford. I'm unclear as to whether he has any relation to Brett, but Kurt Crawford asks, who is the toughest matchup for Oklahoma's offensive line and defensive backs?
I'm guessing he means for the rest of the season and not necessarily Saturday against TCU. I mean, I have to answer this question one way or the other, so I'll say for the rest of the season. It's a tough question because so many teams right now, have an incomplete by their name. We just don't have a big enough picture to judge accurately who is exactly what. So having said that, I will offer Oklahoma State as the toughest test for the DBs, especially with Tylan Wallace, who I think is the best receiver in the country. I do. I voted for him a couple of years ago for the Fred Biletnikoff Trophy, and I felt good about it. As far as the best matchup for OU's offensive line, the worst matchup for OU's offensive line, I know you guys are not going to want to hear this, but I'm going to say Oklahoma State again. I know TCU comes with that reputation, and West Virginia comes with the Stills brothers. Yeah. And believe it or not, right now, Parker, West Virginia is ranked as the number one total defense in the country. It's early, but it's nice to be number one either way. But I think Jim Knowles has Oklahoma State playing at a really high level in his third year. And I think you start, running blitzes from Amen Bongbemiga and Malcolm Rodriguez, and you have a bunch of experienced guys covering your receivers in the secondary. That defensive line has really, really gotten better this year. They returned all four guys. So I think that's really going to be a tough matchup for Oklahoma up front. Parker? Gonzo Strangelove asks a great question. One of the biggest concerns this year is how frequently OU struggles to run the ball without putting multiple tight ends and H-backs on the line. Completely agree. Chris Murray seems to be a more physical player than the current guards. How seriously or soon do you expect him to challenge for a prominent role?
I would say this Saturday, John. I really would, because I think Chris Murray, outside of Creed Humphrey, is ostensibly the most talented lineman that Oklahoma has immediately. And I don't think that's hyperbolic to say. And Tyrese Robinson and Marquise Hayes have been serviceable, but not fantastic. And I think bringing a guy like Chris Murray into the fold immediately presents a really competitive push to both of those guys, Tyrese Robinson and Hayes, at the guard position. And so I don't know if Murray starts right away. That might be too much of a leap in the here and now. But I do think that Chris Murray is going to be starting along the offensive line at some point this season for Oklahoma. And I do think it will be sooner rather than later. I think it'll be in the next few weeks. All right, John. Last question for you. A follow-up from the great Gonzo Strangelove. Did you get your Fletcher's Corny Dog?
Alas, Gonzo, my heart is broken and my stomach is empty. I did not. There was like an hour wait to get them before the game, before kickoff, when Parker and I walked into the Cotton Bowl. It was about 2 hours, 2.5 hours before. There was an hour-long wait. And then by the time we got done, they were packed up and gone home. And yes, that made me very sad. Broke my 16-year streak of pounding at least one Fletcher's Corny Dog, more often than not, two. Our next podcast drops Sunday post-game, remember. And if you think about it, please send us something for the mailbag while it's fresh on your mind, because that's when it's always the best. On Twitter, you can send it to John E. Hoover or at Parker Thune. Listen to the SI Sooners podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Google, iHeart, yes, iHeart, or wherever you get your podcasts, or on your Amazon-enabled device. Just say, Alexa, play the SI Sooners podcast. Or go to the allsooners.com website, click on the player, and listen on your phone, your tablet, or your computer. And you can always watch the video version on my YouTube channel, John Hoover Media. For Parker Thune, I'm John Hoover. See you guys.